Crossing the Frontiers of Communism. How the leaders of Communist China and North Korea broke up the barriers of communism by indoctrinating and empowering the younger generation. By Kara Ng, Jerry Jin, and Nathan Ng. First, let's talk about the historical context. What historical factors contributed to the development of a new frontier? In 1911, a Chinese leader named Sun Yat-sen led the Wuchang Uprising against the Qing dynasty. On January 1st, 1912, the Republic of China was proclaimed, ending over 2,000 years of dynastic rule. Shortly after the Republic of China was established, Sun Yat-sen gave his power to a military general, Ren Shikai. When he took over, he destroyed all national and provincial assemblies and declared himself the Emperor of China. He was fiercely opposed and abdicated a year later. During this time, China was ruled by shifting coalitions and military leaders. In 1920, Sun Yat-sen made a base in Guangzhou to unite China and made it in alliance with the Chinese Communist Party. Sun named his party the Kuomintang, or the KMT. After Sun's death, his disciple, Chiang Kai-shek, took over the KMT and set out to bring China under his control. Once he took power, Chiang Kai-shek started purging out the Chinese Communist Party. In 1934, the CCP were driven out from their mountain bases, embarking on the Long March. It was during the Long March that the communist revolutionist Mao Zedong was recognized as their leader. 3 years before the Long March, Japan started invading China. With the same goal to drive out the Japanese, the CCP and KMT decided to temporarily join forces and fought side by side until 1937. 8 years later, in 1945, the Japanese lost in World War II and they were finally driven out of China. Once the Japanese were gone, the KMT and the CCP picked up where they left off. By 1949, the Chinese Communist Party controlled most of China, and in that same year they defeated the KMT, forcing the KMT to flee to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China a communist country. Where did the communist ideology come from? In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote a book titled The Communist Manifesto. In his book, The Communist Manifesto, Marx claimed that capitalism, with its emphasis on profit and private ownership, created inequality among the people. He proposed a new economic system, communism, where everybody is equal and where everything is shared. Russia had a civil war in 1917, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, eventually won in 1922. He then created the USSR, the first socialist state. Lenin's creation of the first socialist state and Marx's Communist Manifesto both played a big part in Mao making China communist. Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910, and the Korean villages suffered from the Japanese rule. In the book, Nothing to Envy, Barbara Demick says, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over the radio. It took several days for the news to reach the village. When the boys heard the news, they ran to the barracks where the Japanese were garrisoned and found that they pulled out. The occupation was over. With Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, Korea was handed over to the victorious countries. They decided to temporarily split Korea across the 38th parallel, with the Soviets managing the northern part, and the US managing the southern section. This division was supposed to be temporary until the US, the UK, the USSR, and China could arrange for a single government. However, these four countries could not agree on establishing Korea's national government, so the US passed the issue to the UN. The United Nations decided that the legal government of Korea was the Republic of Korea because the Republic of Korea was not communist. About a year later, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War started as North Korean troops crossed the border into South Korea. The Korean War technically hasn't ended even now because both sides are at a stalemate. The border is still the 38th parallel, but now it has become a demilitarized zone. The first leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was influenced by Marx's book on communism while he was attending high school in China. He was so affected by Marxism and his ideas that he made North Korea communist.
What obstacles caused the need to explore a new frontier? After Mao assumed leadership of China under the Chinese Communist Party, he quickly implemented many communist practices in place by initiating a rectification program, where the so-called bourgeois, that is, the intellectuals, teachers, and landlords, were sent to labor camps in hopes of re-educating them to assimilate with the communist culture. Mao promised many freedoms like rent reduction and land redistribution for the Chinese peasants, including freedom of the press, assembly, speech, and thought, much like that from the United States First Amendment rights. For a while, many Chinese citizens, that is, mostly the peasants, supported Mao's work and happily obeyed the state. But later they realized many of these so-called freedoms weren't being given to them, and that Mao wasn't keeping his promises. Because China was a communist country, Mao could not rely on capitalism to support their country's economic growth, as it would contradict his own political party and leadership. Following the Soviets' model for economic development, Mao initiated China's 5-year plan called the Great Leap Forward, attempting to turn his own country into an independent industrial powerhouse. He encouraged the Chinese citizens to do this by creating their own steel in their own backyards, so that they could become a self-sufficient nation. However, this was a dangerous and disastrous plan, as many Chinese citizens were unaware of how to make steel in the first place. In addition, the focus on industries affected the agricultural output of the city, and grain was in short supply. In 1962, the man-made crisis took a turn for the worse. It unfolded into a period called the Great Starvation. After the Chinese Civil War, Mao owed Russia for aiding the Chinese Communist Party when they fought together against the KMT. To pay them back, Mao decided that he would pay them through the farmers' grain, starving more than 20 million of his own people to death. In Dao Chen's Colors of the Mountain autobiography, he relates of the events he faced before and during the Cultural Revolution growing up in China. Chen says, quote, Chairman Mao had had a parting of ways with the Soviets, and now they wanted all their loans repaid or they would be blood. So Mao ordered his citizens to cut down on meals and be hungry heroes so he could repay the loans. That year also saw a forbidding drought that made fields crack throughout China like wheat. Rice plants turned yellow and withered young. Unquote. The 5-year plan turned out to be a great leap backward. So Mao quickly sought to find a revolution to ensure that the people would still strongly support him. He launched the Cultural Revolution, an attempt to capture the glory days of the revolution and fire up the masses by empowering the youth. Knowing that the youth were most impressionable to his ideas and propaganda, Mao targeted them to support his leadership. This caused many students to denounce their teachers, employers, and sometimes even their parents to tear down the four olds: old culture, old habits, old ideas, and old customs, which often meant demolishing buildings and art. Chen wrote, quote, School was chaos. Everyone ran around mindlessly doing nothing. Everyone wore red armbands bearing the words Little Guard. Teachers could do almost nothing to remedy the situation for fear of being branded as stinking intellectual or counter-revolutionary. End quote. Through the Cultural Revolution, Mao was able to break past the barriers of communism's disastrous effects and regain support by seizing up the Chinese youth by the masses, propagandizing and indoctrinating them in order that they might demonstrate their loyalty to the state. Similarly, in 1953, Kim Il-sung established a theocratic dictatorship in North Korea after the split from the Korean War. He portrayed himself as a god, using fear of death as punishment so that everyone would worship and acknowledge him as the supreme leader. In Barbara Demick's book, Nothing to Envy, she speaks of how the North Koreans live under the most repressive totalitarian regime today. The North Korean government, also known as Juche, was, as Kim Il-sung claimed, being the master of revolution and reconstruction in one's own country. This means holding fast to an independent position and displaying the revolutionary spirit of self-reliance. But that was far from what the Juche form of government really was. In reality, quote, the North Koreans' indoctrination began in infancy, during the 14-hour days spent in factory daycare centers. Every song, film, newspaper article, and billboard was designed to deify Kim Il-sung. End quote. North Koreans' basic human rights were unrecognized, such as the freedom of speech, assembly, or press. Travel was prohibited unless permission was granted by the government. Foreign goods were illegal, and ration tickets were to be shown at the markets each week to obtain groceries. Any of the strict and unreasonable laws that Kim Il-sung put in place were subject to severe punishment should any of his citizens dare to disobey or defy his laws or authority. Loyalty and filial devotion are the supreme qualities of a revolutionary. This was a particularly handy quote for taming a rebellious child. Demick says that the children were never to forget that they owed everything to the national leadership. Like other North Korean children, they didn't celebrate their own holidays, but those of Kim Il-sung on April 15th. These days were national holidays, and they were often the only days people would get meat in their ration packages. A few days before each birthday, the Workers' Party would distribute to every child more than 2 pounds of sweets. It was truly an impressive gift for kids. All kinds of cookies, jellies, chocolates, and chewing gums. When the time came, the children lined up in front of the portraits of the Supreme Leader to express their gratitude. "Thank you, dear Father Kim Il-sung," the children would cry. After Kim Il-sung's death, his son Kim Jong-il assumed dictatorship. Students were required to sing of how North Korea was the best country in the world, and that they had nothing to envy. If students couldn't read from the Kim Il-sung's theses on socialist education, the teacher would read them aloud, and the children were encouraged to repeat key phrases after her in unison. Kim Il-sung knew that by constantly repeating these lies into the students' minds, they would hear enough to believe it and take it for its word. After the ideological training, the lessons moved on to more familiar subjects. But the great leader was never far from the children's minds. Whether they were studying math, science, reading, music, or art, the children were taught to revere the leadership and hate the enemy. For example, a first-grade math book contained the following questions. 8 boys and 9 girls are singing anthems in praise of Kim Il-sung. How many children are singing in total? Or, 3 soldiers from the Korean People's Army killed American soldiers. How many American soldiers were killed by each of them if they all killed an equal number of enemy soldiers? This leads us to the next point. What is the new frontier? By overcoming obstacles, both Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong were able to break past the barriers of communism's disastrous effects and regain support by seizing up the youth by the masses, propagandizing and indoctrinating them in order that they might demonstrate their loyalty to the state.
Mao himself was influenced by nationalism at a young age. He soon became attracted to Marxism-Leninism in 1920s, and his ideas were strongly anti-Western and anti-imperialist and focuses on the struggle between the capitalist and working class. Mao knew the power and passion that could be ignited by the younger generation. Mao Zedong incorporated the principles of Marxism to develop a high-class struggle in the Cultural Revolution, and in doing so, he also gave major power to the working class. People, places, and ideas. In order to transform the frontier and get rid of the resistance of communist practices and ideas from the older generation, Mao brilliantly endorsed the young Red Guards to eradicate anti-revolutionary ideas. Short-term impacts. What are the short-term impacts of indoctrinating the youth? Mao had encouraged the younger generation to get out of their schools and move out to the countryside in order to be re-educated by the farmers in their fields. These Red Guards loved it because they didn't have to be in school, and millions of them marched to the countryside as they sang the Red Guard song. However, once they found out how hard farming really was, then they began abusing the farmers and then stealing their daughters. The Red Guards were given the power to report on disloyal teachers and even family members. They raided homes, burned old books, teachings, and destroyed artifacts. Fear was one of Mao's strategies, and he did this by using the Red Guards to destroy the old ideas. This helped in having the rebels, especially from the older generation, to obey and keep their ideas to themselves, and it also strengthened Mao's leadership and broke up the barriers of communism. So what were some of the short-term impacts of North Korea's regime? Specifically, the Kim dynasty's Juche indoctrination of the youth. Kim Jong-un stated that soldiers were always supposed to be the first to get food. The Songgun idea, or military first, was what he advocated in their education. The school children were taught that they were to sacrifice their food for the army, and that would protect them from the evil Americans. However, this wasn't true at all because these soldiers were walking around with their belts tied around so tight to themselves because their uniforms simply didn't fit due to starvation. Even at night, these soldiers would abandon their posts and steal vegetables and fruits from private property. The regime could never produce enough food for its people. Sometimes desperate, starving Korean people would even cross over to the Chinese border just for food, and thousands of the North Korean women would get sold to Chinese men for wives or get sent back if they were caught. However, when the Cultural Revolution in China ended abruptly with Mao's death, it was devastating for those who benefited from it. As one youth recalled from the true story, Colors of the Mountain, Mao told everyone to screw your teachings, burn the schools, colleges, and that they were all bad. And now all of a sudden, they had changed their minds on us who'd followed their great stupid teachings. The youths realized that Mao didn't really care for the younger generation at all in China. And one youth noted from the Colors of the Mountain and lamented that Mao only cared about making them ignorant, and so that they wouldn't realize what an evil man he really was. The devastating effects is that the whole generation of youth during that time were deprived of education, affecting their livelihood. Here's a quick fun fact. Did you know that Mao Zedong was responsible for the deaths of 40 to 80 million victims compared to Hitler's 20,946,000? But yet today, Mao Zedong is still known as a hero in communist China because history has been rewritten to make Mao a hero. South Korea's Article 3 of its constitution states that all of its people in the entire Korean peninsula, including North Koreans, are automatically citizens. South Korea states that they are the rightful government of all the Korean peninsula. People from South Korea have begun to smuggle videos and thumb drives to show the actual hardship that the North Koreans are facing. This risks Kim Jong-un's power. The popular culture in these videos and thumb drives help to change people's minds and has in result caused them to defect. Over 300,000 people have defected to North Korea this very day.
What is the significance or legacy of this event in history? Here were some of the effects of the indoctrination of the youth in North Korea. Although the North Koreans suffered many hardships, they will praise their great general and great leader for every good thing they received, no matter how small. For example, when a Nepalese eye surgeon went to North Korea to heal blind people, every North Korean who was healed would praise their leaders again and again, literally crying from happiness. Although the person who healed the North Korean people was the eye surgeon, They thanked their leader nevertheless. This was the effect of North Korea's plan in indoctrinating their people. No matter what their great leader did, the North Korean people would always believe in him and thank him for everything. The impact of China's indoctrination is evident in one conversation between a teen peasant and his grandfather. "Grandfather, why do you call villages joining the Poor People's League, voting for communists, and having their sons join communist armies or daughters enroll in schools crimes? These are patriotic acts. Did we have a free school before? Did we ever get news of the world before the communists brought us radios? Who told us what the world was like? You say the community has no place in China, but did we even have a community before? How about your farm? Wasn't there a big mortgage on it to landlord Wang? My sister starved to death 3 years ago, but haven't we had plenty to eat since the communists came? You say it's bitter, but it isn't bitter for us." Da Chen, the author of Colors of the Mountain, was born after the communist takeover, and this is a feeling he remembers when Mao died. "I had been told not to analyze him because he was wiser. No, the wisest. I was to follow him and love him with all my heart. As a young boy, I had once shouted the slogan, 'Long live Chairman Mao,' so many times that by the next day I had lost my voice. Even though my parents' generation hated him, I had embraced him in my own way. I didn't know any better. A cult mentality had already been forged on me, and it hurt me deeply to be separated from such an event."